one of the key features of our Bill of Rights is a set of socio-economic rights, the promise of a better life for all. And we all know the massive impact that the coronavirus pandemic has had on these rights. And, I would like us to focus on that, because I think many of the civil and political rights violations have been discussed and documented extensively. But the socio-economic impact on hunger, on education, and then also what is the way forward in this regard.
Okay, so let's look at some of those a little more closely then, Professor.
Sure. So, we already in South Africa, as is well known, have very high levels of poverty and inequality, and it's worth pausing for a second to reflect on the fact that, 25% of our population live below the food poverty line, which means that they have less than 585 Rand per person per month to live on. And if you take the upper bound poverty line, which is 1,268 per person per month, 55% of our population live below that line. And these are really, staggering figures which the coronavirus pandemic, with the loss of employment brought about through the lockdown measures, the 7% contraction of our economy last year, has really wreaked, sort of devastation on lives and livelihoods. The Children's Institute at UCT put out a recent study, for example, to say that child hunger increased by 50%, with 1 in 6 households reporting that children went hungry because they did not have enough money to buy food.
Now, when we describe, Professor, when we describe child hunger, is it based on a certain number of meals per day? Is it based on nutrition? What is it based on?
So child hunger really refers to hunger. I mean, if we refer to nutrition, in other words, a healthy diet, a nutrition diet, and there you can have either, malnutrition resulting in obesity, in other words, children getting the wrong kind of nutrients and so forth, or resulting in stunting, getting insufficient nutrients. And there the figures are essentially that 1 in 4 children are stunted, in that they are too short for their age because they're not getting enough nutrients for a healthy diet. And, we've seen programs enacted that have cushioned these blows. I mean, the COVID-19 350 Rand grant was, an important cushion. It was 350, so not really even coming up to the food poverty line, but nevertheless an important intervention. But what is particularly worrying, Hugo, is that this grant is coming to an end in April. The President announced this in the State of the Nation address. And we see this also with, record unemployment levels. So, we have sort of 32.5% unemployment in the fourth quarter of last year. And if you take people who are discouraged, from looking for work, that figure goes up to over 40%. So the question really is, what safety nets are in place for people going forward? And, this is also in the context where government has embarked on a so-called fiscal consolidation program, where it's reducing government expenditure in order to stabilize debt levels. And you see massive cuts to areas such as education, to even healthcare, which is so critical still with the pandemic with us. And you see below inflation increases to social grants, like the vital child support grant. So I think this is very worrying when we reflect on Human Rights Day, that we have promised people a better life. The Constitution has all these socio-economic rights, and what is government's strategy and pathway to realizing these rights?
Well, you talk about the cuts that government is implementing, certainly those budget cuts that impact fundamental human rights in areas of health, education. Where would government be advised to reduce cuts, if not certainly to impact the livelihoods of the average South African citizen?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and it brings one to the whole issue of human rights principles in budgeting. So particularly where in situations of crisis where governments feel they have to reduce budgets to stabilize debt or to deal with austerity budgeting, or to deal with shortfalls, there is a set of principles that the United Nations has developed, which requires governments to look very carefully at other areas where cuts can be made, rather than impacting on the disadvantaged and vulnerable of the population. So, for example, avoiding, looking at areas of eliminating corruption and wasteful expenditure, looking at areas of, given the inequalities in our country with wealth gaps so big and wealth increasingly concentrated among the top 10% of the population, are we doing enough in our tax policy to generate the income for social expenditure? And then, these thorny questions of should failed and failing state-owned enterprises be bailed out? But the point is, these are questions on which, there can be debate, and a number of civil society organizations such as the Budget Justice Coalition have put forward alternatives, which Parliament is currently looking at. And my hope on this Human Rights Day is that MPs will look very carefully at where the impact of these cuts are being felt and ensure that it's not the poorest and most marginalized that are feeling the pain of these measures.
Do you get a sense that government does not have its finger on the pulse, so to speak, in as far as many of these decisions and budget cuts that are made?
I think there is a concern, and this was also raised by the acting head of the Financial and Fiscal Commission, Michael Sachs, in his submission, that, the principles of human rights budgeting, and it sounds vague and possibly a bit airy-fairy, but there are actually set principles developed, and I'm not really convinced that when government designs macroeconomic policy and budgeting, that these principles are really sort of taken seriously and integrated into decision making. For example, the principle of non-discrimination. When government cuts expenditure on early childhood development or water or healthcare, it's often women, and particularly in this country, black women, who bear the burden of having to provide services in the home, take care of children, the elderly, and so forth. And how is this factored into this budgetary decision making? So the key message is, all human rights require resources for their realization, and is there a proper costing of what is needed to realize these rights in our Bill of Rights?
Well, one of those rights I'd like to think is social security, and we've noticed that women again continue to be receiving the short end of the stick, so to speak, around this. Again, looking at crime stats for the latter part of 2020, more than 12,000 suffering GBV cases.
Yes, absolutely. And, I don't have the figures budgeted at my fingertips tips at the moment for the GBV violence prevention strategy and so forth. But again, you would need a huge amount of funding to go into police investigations, to go into the NPA, to go into the Tutamazela care centers, and so forth. And, there would need to be this budgeting. And yet we also see that some institutions like the NPA are suffering, budget shortages, whereas they are obviously critical to proper investigation of GBV, that we face in our country. So it's all very well to have strategies and plans of actions, and these are important, but they also need to be properly budgeted for.
Professor, I don't have stats, but I understand that institutions of higher learning, such as universities, have certain figures that they contribute to GBV. In institutions such as Stellenbosch and others, are you aware of any measures that are being carried out to curtail and to speak out or institute programs specifically against GBV?
Yes, so the Stellenbosch University has had a GBV task team that has, since, Stellenbosch, like all higher education institutions, have not been, immunized from this scourge by any means. And we've seen a range of cases of abuse in Stellenbosch, in particularly residence contexts and so forth. So there has been a task team. There's been a very active staff-student alliance working on this, and there are reports and measures being taken. Again, I come back to the point, one has to put one's money where one's mouth is. So the proper funding of these programs, proper education on gender diversity, etc., at residences to change, the institutional culture and, the forms of toxic masculinities which are so prevalent across South Africa, are really desperately needed.
Professor, finally, before we let you go, one of the reasons I believe that human rights are certainly abused is because people, young women, do not understand that they have certain rights, that you can say no, or you can't prevent certain abuses. Do you have any programs that speak specifically to equipping women with the knowledge, the skill set to defend their human rights?
Yes, I think this is such a vital area you raise, Hugo, is human rights education, which, starts, ideally from the curriculum of schooling. Ideally one would want human rights awareness and those critical institutions such as, offered by the Commission for Gender Equality, the SA Human Rights Commission, and so forth, to be integrated into these programs, and then, budgeting for human rights education in the population. Access to justice, as you know, in our country is such a major shortfall. You might know you have rights, but not have access to the means of enforcing those rights. So again, I think one of the ways that government can combat the scourge of gender-based violence is making these programs accessible, employing community workers to work in communities to combat this scourge.